Good morning to the leadership of the Council on Higher Education, to the leadership of USAf, led by Prof. Motwa, the leadership of the Council on Higher Education, led by Professor Temba Msila, all other guests and participants in this prestigious and very important conference, the second National Higher Education Conference. My name is Luzuko Buku, and I'll be chairing the proceedings in this plenary session today. I serve as a chairperson of the Monitoring, Research and Advice Committee of the Council on Higher Education. In introducing this session, which is held under the theme Engaged Scholarship and Decolonization, Transforming Higher Education Through Community Development. We will quickly move to the panel, which will be leading the engagements today. The introduction of the session will be done by Professor Mpine Makoe, and our speakers will be Professor Lesley Grange and Professor Vuyisile Msila. Now, just to highlight the importance of this session and this theme, before I give to Professor Makoe, one would the sector always had an understanding that transforming higher education will be through the three steering mechanisms, which is in planning, funding, and quality management. But as it is happening and as it is appearing, there need to be new ways and more creative ways of injecting a transformation in the sector and bringing a decolonization into life. So that's the importance of this session, as it's an attempt to think about new ways of engaging with the university as a social institution and engaging with higher education as a critical sector in any transformation of a society, not only universities. So without further ado, I will proceed to call on Professor Mpine Makoe to do the introduction of the session and the session speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ntate Buku, for your kind introduction. Dumelang. Mine is just to introduce the session on this last day of the conference. The core mission, that is the purpose of the university, is that it was created to teach and to provide an environment where learning could take place. It was also created to produce knowledge and also to service the community. These can be looked at as a three-legged pot, all mutually and equally central to the structure of the pot. But we know in higher education that community engagement leg has not received as much attention as the other two has, which makes it impossible for this pot to stand. So the aim of this session, therefore, is to bring together these three areas and three legs in a systematic way in order to address the grand challenges of our higher education sector. In opening the session on Wednesday, Professor Motwa raised a question about who owns the university. Probably we may need to ask ourselves, who owns the university? And we may respond to this question in a different way. In this session, Professor Msila and Professor Grange will take us through the theme on the engaged scholarship and decolonization, transforming through community development. To be engaged, which is the topic of this conference, is to be involved. How do we ensure that higher education is involved? How do we show that the curricula that we teach, the curricula that we develop is addressing the community? In order for students to develop an awareness of the social impact of what they learn and do it in order to transform the community. So if the curricula is not in line with what we need to do in terms of transforming the community, in terms of transforming South Africa, we are not doing what we are supposed to do. The questions that may rise from this is that, does the curricula address the development needs of a fledgling democracy? A lot of speakers during this conference have spoken about this, have spoken about the development needs, they've spoken about democracy, and what type of knowledges are we aligned with as we are developing this democracy. I think as we move forward with the future, these are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves. Are we responsive? Are we relevant to the community? And is all these things, if we are not responsive, or even we are not relevant, who are we in relation to the community that we serve? As we are preparing to reimagine the university of the future, the university that we aspire for, the university that will address the development needs of the country, the economic growth of the country, the social cohesion, which is one area that universities are ignoring. And the social cohesion deals with, it's central to how we engage the community in our sector, not community coming into our sector, but engage in equal partnership. The only way that we can transform higher education through community development is to address issues of knowledge production and knowledge dissemination. Who owns knowledge? And how do we own knowledge? What type of knowledges do we engage with? Can the community see themselves in the curriculum? Can the community relate to the curriculum that we teach? Does the curriculum address the development needs of a fledgling democracy? And maybe part of the problem is the legacy, is the history where we are coming from. The colonial history, the apartheid history, that we find ourselves, that we continue with the systems and structures that were developed and designed for a different type of a higher education that was meant to oppress the community. And if we continue to build on a system and structures that were meant for different things, then we will perpetually be irrelevant in the society that we are intending to do. So as we are building and moving forward, we need to look at areas that need strengthening in order for us to move forward, in order for higher education, not only to be responsive, but to be relevant to the South Africa we want and the South Africa we aspire for. So let's make sure that the pot stands firmly on its three legs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that introduction. Prof is the Commonwealth of Learning Chair at the University of South Africa. Apologies, Prof, I did not make that introduction, but you are very known to us and to the sector. Now, in moving forward, we'll take the presentations from Professor Lesley Grange. First, Professor Grange is a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Education in Stellenbosch, and is also a member of the Council on Higher Education. So we serve together in council. So, Prof, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you also to USAf and the CHE for an opportunity to engage in this important conversation. So I've entitled my talk, Decolonization, Engagement, and the Third Possibility for the University. So let me just say a few things. That I'm going to suggest that the University of the future already exists. And the focus of my talk will be on indigenous communities and the indigenous futurity. So some introductory comments. So my presentation will be critical, but hopefully also offer affirmative propositions. The presentation is an outcome of thinking with others, specifically with Rosie Braidotti, Gilles Deleuze, and Felix Guattari, La Paperson, Eve Tuck, and Kay Wayne Yang. Kay Wayne Yang and Paperson is the same person that writes under different names. I want to say something about thinking and thanking. They have common etymological roots, and Donna Haraway says that in a very deep sense, therefore, whenever we're able to think, we also therefore need to be thankful, because we're always building on the ideas of others. Our ideas are always influenced by others. So about thinking, this is a very well-known quote. So Albert Einstein said that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And Martin Heidegger said that the most thought-provoking thing, which is opposite to the times we find ourselves in our thought-provoking time, is that we are still not thinking. And Odora Hoppers and Richards said that if thinking can plausibly be identified as something central to what universities are about, it can also be identified at this point in history as something in need of rethinking. So let us attempt to engage in some thinking or rethinking. And I want to start with what we're experiencing at this present time, the COVID-19 pandemic, and want to suggest with others that the COVID-19 pandemic is a human-made disaster. Some feminists have said a man-made disaster. So it's loss of biodiversity, neoliberal capitalist agricultural practices that are producing more virulent viruses, and tied to that, there's a whole lot of other aspects that have been laid bare during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic has also been a portal to ongoing crises of racism, gender-based violence, religious-based violence, inequality, poverty, xenophobia, and etc. Now, the inhuman events of the 20th century, and there are many we can name, from apartheid, Nazism, genocides of all kinds, as well as what we're experiencing now, are all manifestations of the crisis of humanism. So it depends on the lineage you take, but I'm going to go along with the lineage that Rosie Braidotti provides for us. If we go back, it goes right back to man, who's the measure of all things, said by Protagoras, and later on developed further and became evident in Leonardo da Vinci's idea of the Vitruvian man, which became this the perfect man in terms of its physical body. But this morphs into a molar identity, that becomes the man of reason. And this mole identity is the ideal subject that was produced, particularly during European Enlightenment, as masculine, white, Eurocentric, heterosexual, able-bodied, urban, and speaks a standard language. It's this mole identity that has become the screen against which all other beings are declared different and viewed as either less human or non-human. It's implicated in the imperial project, the European imperial project and colonialism. So fast forward a little bit, this results, if we take the lineage right up to thoughts around posthumanism, that it produces a current condition that involves the Anthropocene extinction. So we're seeing the sixth mass extinction in the currently, and there's the possibility that this kind of extinction could lead to the extinction of the human species itself. And then secondly, it's humans' entanglement with advanced technologies that is making us rethink what the unit of reference is for the human. And so in this Anthropocene and the possibility of a post-Anthropocene, the importance of embracing life in all its connectedness becomes important. And on the other side, resisting the negative of posthumanism, robotics, drones, artificial intelligence, biological warfare, the commodification of the body, ecophages that one reads about in science fiction, without actually becoming technophobic. Now I want you to increase your coefficient of transversality and think about how the lineage produces something else. And that is the legacy of colonialism, even after colonial powers have been removed administratively. The legacy of colonialism, which is a colonial matrix of power that has even morphed into a global colonial matrix of power, that is about who controls knowledge and subjectivity, who controls gender and sexuality, who controls the economy, including the land, who controls the authority, the institutions of authority, and produces neo-colonialism, racism, patriarchy, environmental destruction, and many other things. So what have been some of the responses, broad responses to the COVID-19 pandemic? We've seen an increase in the use of high technology, and we're engaging with this currently as well. Hopes in vaccines and biomedical solutions. And we've seen an increase in cognitive as well as platform capitalism. And just on the latter part, it's interesting that crises, the recent crisis, the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 produced profit-sharing platform companies like Uber and Airbnb, and we've seen owners of Zoom, etc., in this current crisis actually become billionaires, and inequalities in the world actually growing. Now, what humans are doing, and doing so more rapidly, is they're doing the things that brought on, and more of those things that brought on the COVID-19 crisis in the first place. And the university is implicated in that. If you think I'm an anti-vaccine campaigner, no, I'm not. So I am a skyborg and I am doubly vaccinated, but I'm suggesting that those solutions are actually band-aid solutions. So what should we be doing during this pandemic? And I go along with Bretotti that says we ought to mourn. We ought to mourn the dead humans and other humans, and that we should not build our scholarship on the dead bodies of humans and non-humans, because that would be unethical. Jacques Derrida, in his work on friendship, reminds us that A friend, one friend will go first and the other will be left to mourn. And many of us find ourselves in that position currently, having lost family, colleagues, and friends. And we can learn much about mourning from indigenous peoples. I don't have time to go into the detail, but at least there's one way of looking at decolonization from an indigenous perspective, that it involves rediscovery and recovery, but that leads to a next phase of mourning that then enables healing and dreaming, commitment, and therefore action. So I want to go to talk about decolonization and present a more radical perspective on decolonization from people in the indigenous world that use the term decolonization and don't necessarily make this distinction between decolonization and coloniality, but introduces different notions. So Tuck and Yang says that decolonization cannot be grafted on pre-existing discourses or frameworks, even if they are critical, anti-racist, and focused on social justice. That decolonization is not a synonym. Decolonization is not a term we can exchange for things that we want to do to improve our universities. So there are many good things we might want to do to improve our universities, to transform them, to renew our curricula, to do all kinds of things, but that is not decolonization. Decolonization for Tuck and Yang brings about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. Because for indigenous peoples, land is not a possession, it's not property. It's about epistemology. It's epistemological because indigenous people will say that the land is our teacher, that their knowing and their being, that's the ontological, is imbricated with land, and they engage in interaction, not in interaction with land. And it's tied to their very belief systems. So it's about cosmological relationships too. And so when people are dispossessed of land in that sense, it's not just about the physical land, but it's tied up with the entire being, their ways of knowing, as well as the spiritual dimension to their lives. So Tuck and Yang talks about three different types of colonialism, and I'm not going to go for the sake of time into all three, but they talk about settler colonialism that is actually untheorized in South Africa in particular. There's a lot of work done in the USA by indigenous scholars and so on. But of course, European people came here, started by building a refreshment station. And Jonathan Jansen said years ago, I hope he hasn't forgotten about that they've been refreshing themselves ever since. Because settler colonialism ties to ownership of land. And I don't need to tell any of you who owns land in South Africa. But the effects of settler colonialism, as I said, is untheorized in South Africa. Of course, settlers make moves towards innocence, and I won't have much time to talk about it, but there's settler nativism, what is called in the USA and other places at the grandmother complex, where people try and look for how they have some kind of indigenous blood. That the settler adoption of fantasy, so becoming Indian, or people engage in what they call critical hawk-eye intellectual, who tries to look at both what is said in the indigenous world and the Western world, and try to take a superior position in the light of both of those. Colonial equivocation, they're suggesting that you can't simply say that all these other things tied to social justice are linked to are synonyms for decolonization. That it's important to understand that due to settler colonialism, people have been racialized differently. And then there's also a critique of critical theory and pedagogy. This whole idea that you can free the mind and the rest will follow. And then, of course, indigenous people, what often happens to them, they become at risk, or they become asterisk people. Just an asterisk there because their numbers have become so small. So we think about some of the First Nations people in South Africa that are landless, whose language is not included in the official languages, etc. And we can, of course, take that further. But all of this forecloses on indigenous futurity. So I want to talk now about the university. Chairperson thinks about 3 universities, and I give them different names later. The first world university is the Neoliberal University. So in this particular university, it is a machine of accumulations and expansions and engages in revenue-generating enterprises. The second world university invests in critical theory and critiques the media and capitalist systems in the West. And then you get the third world university, which lives on the scrap material of the first and second world universities and reassemble them towards decolonizing purposes. So let's talk about the neoliberal university that accumulates, and we know this university well. It charges fees and awards degrees. It celebrates diversity and often extends this diversity to say it's not only the diversity of people, but the diversity of ideas. It rewards excellence in all kinds of ways, which in some ways become a vacuous word. One university even gave somebody an award for excellence in parking. It invests in advanced technologies and embraces 4IR. It participates in university rankings. It engages in for-profit initiatives and partnerships, and it biomedicalizes ethics. And there are many more things we can add. So it engages on the engaged part with other radicals in the university, with the public through the media and in critiquing the media. It engages with local communities. So just to get back here to the neoliberal university, sorry. So it engages with the high-tech economy in partnerships with for-profit private companies. It engages in global science networks with corporate and donor funders, with local communities, but in colonizing ways. Community engagement becomes a performance indicator. So the Emancipatory University, it critiques dominant ideologies. It's committed to transforming society. Its agenda is social justice. It's anti-racist, feminist. It's inclusive in relation to LGBTQIA communities, to the people with disabilities. It teaches critical theory and deconstruction in the humanities and elsewhere, and it's utopian. It has this idea that we will get to a university where professors won't profess anymore. It engages with other radicals in the university, with the public through the media, with local communities to bring about change, with marginalized groups with the aim of empowering them. Then the third university. And the third university, Chairperson argues, is a university that, firstly, that the university is an assemblage of machines and not a monolithic entity. So there are different kinds of machines, and the way they use machines here is not on what the substance of machines, the mechanical notion of a machine, but machines in the sense of it's something that machines do things. And you've got to trace that to the work of Deleuze and Guattari, that machines are able to do things, and you can only know what a machine can do in relation to other machines. So I often give my students an exercise in creativity to come up with 100 uses of a brick. Now, a brick is a machine, but a brick might have been designed at some point to build walls and therefore to build buildings and so on. But if you take a brick and you put it in relation to a door, then the brick actually becomes a door stopper. If you put the brick in the hand of a child trying to, who doesn't have access to resources, trying to engage in some athletics training, and you put a brick in their hand, they can view the brick, then becomes a shot put, becomes something other. And that's what machines actually do. And everything in the university is actually a machine. Its machinery is always being subverted towards decolonizing purposes, driven by decolonizing desires, with decolonizing dreamers who are part of the machinery and machines themselves, but subversively so. So Chairperson writes, they wreck, they scavenge, they retool and reassemble the colonizing university into decolonizing contraptions. He refers to these dreamers as skyballs with decolonizing desires. So I want to suggest that the neoliberal university it exists, and we know it, and it's the one that accumulates. But the university is not a monolithic entity. So in the neoliberal university, there's also the emancipatory university. So there are people in the university with emancipatory desires. But in that same university, there's the decolonizing university that strategizes. The first one accumulates, the other one critiques, and the other one strategizes. Because the university is not a monolithic entity. So the decolonizing university already exists. It is assembling. It assembles with the first and the second university. Its mission is decolonization, and it is strategic. Its possibilities are made in the first and second world universities. It is timely, and yet its usefulness constantly expires. It is vocational in the way of the first university. It is unromantic, and it is not worthy of your romance. It is problematic because it's still likely to charge fees and grant degrees and do other things. But importantly, it is anti-utopian. It doesn't certainly believe in this idea that we will get to some utopian idea of what a decolonized university is. And this distinction here is important. It is not interested in decolonizing the university, but more in operating as a decolonizing university. It is a machine that produces machines. I'm almost on my last slide. And it assembles students into skyballs. Now, skyballs are those people who occupy the university. They are au fait and understand everything about the first and second world university. They are au fait with its technologies, everything, but they also have decolonizing desires and invigorate decolonizing lines of flight. I want to show you one example here quickly. Stellenbosch, that's a colonial building at Stellenbosch University, and this is my last slide. That the building was renamed to a building after a Khoi leader that was an interpreter in the 17th century. So it's interesting. Was the building named because of settler guilt? Was it named because of emancipatory interest? Or was it because of decolonizing desires, or all of those three things operating in the university? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks a lot, Prof. We, because of the time, we'll deal with the engagement after Prof. Msila has presented. I hope, Prof. Msila, you are ready. Prof. Msila.
Yes, I'm ready.
Prof. Msila, ladies and gentlemen, participants in the conference, is the head of UNISA's Institute for African Renaissance Studies. He was also a director of the change management in UNISA and is currently a professor at the Thabo Mbeki African School for Public and International affairs. Prof. Msila, the platform is yours. Please keep it to 20 minutes as well. Thanks.
Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers for the honor of inviting me to this august occasion. How much I have gained, during the course of these 2 days, it's really immeasurable. And today, in my allocated slot, I will talk about intellectuals and the engaged university, within the context of decolonial thought. So I would just read from my notes. The decolonial debates and transformation discourses have brought with them several questions, such as who should be the main role players? We now know that looking at DiMaggio and Powell's isomorphism, when we transform the university, we will also change the society and vice versa. We also know the challenges of the involvement of many hands in policymaking, especially when education and society are involved. Therefore, when we discuss the changing idea of a university, we cannot only think this as exclusively the work of the academy's intellectuals. Searching for cognitive justice, epistemological justice, and even decolonial pedagogy need the engagement of communities. The struggles against Eurocentrism and Western hegemony are efforts not only of the academy's intellectuals, but society-wide structures, which include Antonio Gramsci's organic intellectuals. But society-wide structures, yes, arguably, very few of us can disavow with Ali Mazrui, who argues that Pan-Africanism and transformation without intellectuals is doomed. Furthermore, Mazrui defines the intellectual as one who is fascinated by ideas. Intellectuals should lead the transformation and decolonization of society. Some have spoken about the need for Pan-African tolerance if we are to rid Africa of epistemic violence, culturecides as well as linguicides. Yet the paradox of decolonial debates may be that some may suspect that intellectualism is waning. One wonders whether South Africa might experience or is experiencing what happened in the new independent African states in the late 1960s and early 70s. In South Africa, intellectuals from the academy have been haggling over several issues, and these include funding, politicization, pedagogy, language, and of course, decolonization and transformation. In this presentation, I examine the academy's intellectuals and how their accommodation and alienation of organic intellectuals influence the paths of transformation. Euron states, I quote, according to Gramsci, the new intellectual should not only be like the traditional one, a specialist in his subject, but rather a cultural and political leader with a specific function. The function of the intellectual has to be defined according to the needs of a determined society. He must create cultural and political hegemony. The intellectual must be recognized by its organic nature, close quote. The critical questions we need to pose and why some community engagement projects don't make sense. Why do they appear like a waste of time? Why is there no symbiotic relationship between them and the university? 4 themes I discussed in this brief presentation. 1 is examining the responsibility of intellectuals. 2, Pan-African philosophy and intellectuals. 3, the challenges of engaged intellectual debates, and last one, decolonial journeys and communities. In a time when universities in Africa respond to policy windows that have opened for Africanization and decolonization, the role of Pan-Africanism has never been so critical as a guiding light for intellectuals who should lead towards the new social paradigms. One critical role of the intellectuals is to be able to mobilize the people, the communities, to move for transformation. When we look at higher education institutions, the Pan-African thought is supposed to develop and sustain the transformation beyond the university, upon the communities as well. Pan-Africanism that intellectuals need to handle covers a broad agenda which does not only embrace political economy only, but African culture, aesthetics, poetry, and philosophy. The role of the intellectuals should then be to lead the society to the liberation of the mind in all aspects of society. Chinwezu, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Eskia Mphahlele, highlights the role that intellectuals need to champion, and that is to lead the fight to obliterate the vestiges of colonialism. In fact, that is a summary of the role of intellectuals in society today, that they should help magnify that African identity. Two flaws have been prominent since we started the debates on Africanization and decolonization. The first one is thinking that these can happen without the communities outside the university, that the university scholars are adequate in leading the transformation we need. The second flaw is oversight, is thinking that the society can decolonize without anchoring some ideas in Pan-African thought. Without the understanding of Pan-African theory, intellectuals will achieve void decolonization and barren Africanization. The Pan-African thought always utilizes conscience to bring back the scholarship of transformation to the realities of the communities. Without the understanding of the ideals of Pan-Africanism, it is easy to consciously or unconsciously paralyze the goals of transformation. Pan-African thought encompasses relevant community goals, and it is the genesis of epistemic decolonization. It is also critical to begin from the start when colonization killed culture, robbed the African of history, and decimated indigenous languages. Intellectuals who do not start here will miss the understanding of the necessary revolutionary change. Africanization and decolonization that do not start here will be superficial and even defeat the purposes of transforming institutions meaningfully. The decolonial debates have illuminated extremes when it comes to the intellectualism in Africa. On the one hand, much fascination with ideas has been eliminated, whilst on the other, there has been what Joe Minza refers to as intellectual neurosis. Some debates among intellectuals have been energizing in support of the transformation agenda as they support the evolution of higher education institutions. Other debates have been refreshing, trying to build more intellectual communities through engagement. Yet, there have been other skeptical groups who are egotistical, apathetic about transformation, and see no role of communities outside the higher education institutions. In the decolonial debates, several intellectuals have become suspicious of any knowledge that appears to eclipse the global village. In my previous research, I have delineated 4 kinds of intellectuals, and they play a role in, either embracing or alienating communities. The first one, I call them knowers. They are the opposite of learners. They are not the ideal type for constantly changing situations, and they have many blind spots. The second group I refer to as loyalists. They are agreeable, but they are uncritical. Their blind loyalty leads to infantilization of the people, for they demean the ability of the public to think. This infantilization is against the social justice principle, as well as the cognitive and epistemic justice. The third group, denialists. They claim that the change in the status quo will not only drop standards, but is not advisable to society seeking transformation and globalization. It is dangerous to have the powerful people as intellectual denialists. This dumbs down the intellectualism of the masses and detrimental to all those without power. Some intellectuals who are anti-decolonization maintain that it is anti-globalization and the emphasis on Africa is unrealistic in building new and relevant epistemologies. And then the last group I refer to as planetary intellectuals. The decolonial struggles need planetary thinking. The belief in an eclectic approach or in eclectic approaches to cognitive and epistemic justice. The planetary intellectuals believe in the de-Westernization of globalization, and they maintain that the society cannot eschew the medley of a community of ideas that anchor knowledges. They accept critical African intellectualism as well as demarginalization of African knowledge. The center should not only embrace Eurocentrism, but African knowledges as well. Many not only talk of the justice turn, but they embrace the decolonial turn as well. Due to their openness, the planetary intellectual is progressive. The paradox of decolonizing knowledge is the need to be aware of the local community, the local, in relation to the world community, which is the globalized. It is for this reason that what Yongo speaks of interconnectedness of the world. This is what he called globalactics. Cognitive and social justice can be attained when intellectuals have a broader view of the world. Berman underscores the justice turn in political dialogues on transformation with references to equity, equality, and justice. The discussions in this presentation demonstrate how critical it is for intellectuals to be omniscient as they motion the society towards epistemological decolonization and societal transformation. This is about the fascination with ideas. Whilst Maizrui argues that scholars at higher education institutions should lead intellectualism, this cannot be realized in the organic, if the organic intellectuals do not become part of the transforming institutions. In fact, there can be no truly decolonized institutions if these are situated among the colonized communities. The debates in this presentation also demonstrate why we need to decolonize community engagement, for this means, in the Gramscian fashion, that organic intellectuals found in communities bring much about the evolving world of our institutions. Colonial education might have made many to believe that knowledge production resides in institutions of higher learning only, and that public intellectuals are those who are eminent scholars. Dismantling epistemic violence will be realized when intellectual work translates to relevance and is congruent with the positive social values. The building of new public intellectuals should include new research, where the community members do not become mere subjects of research. Higher education institutions should also perceive community members as co-creators of knowledge, especially when dealing with topics of decolonizing knowledge. Knowers will not sharpen the communities. Loyalists will not infantilize the people, and denialists will abdicate their intellectual duties. For meaningful change, our institutions need the wisdom of planetary intellectuals and the inclusivity they stand for in erecting communities that would embrace transformation and champion decolonization. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I've tried to fuse my notes to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. That was very mouthful. That was very an insightful presentation. Prof, I'll just pose this question. It's coming from the YouTube chat, I think, to both of you. And if you can each answer it in a minute. I know it won't take a minute to answer it, but we need to wrap up this session now. The question is, what is a decolonizing university? That on its own, for me, will take us a day just grappling with that, because I have a secondary question as well as to what is an African university. And when we speak of a decolonized university, for instance, what would be a decolonized university? Have we thought of an idea, or have we imagined a university that has been totally decolonized? Just briefly on that, a minute each, and then we'll wrap up the session. Thanks. If you can start, Prof. Msila.
Okay, so your first question is, what is a decolonizing university? A decolonizing university, if you look at what decolonial debates are all about, they are about addressing the damage that was done, the dismantling of society that was done by Eurocentrism. For instance, we talk of culture sites, the killing of culture, linguicides, the killing of languages, historicides, the killing of history, as well as epistemicides. So that a decolonizing university, this is exactly what it wants to achieve, to ensure that it addresses all these, the epistemicides, culture sites, and so on and so on. So we cannot achieve decolonization if we do not really address these. And again, how can this be done? Through research, changing the way we conduct research, and through teaching, changing the way we teach at universities, and so on. I'll give over to my colleague, Prof. Grange.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, it is a question that requires an answer that will probably take days. So let me just say what I try to suggest, that I think there's perhaps no utopian idea of a decolonized university, but a decolonized university is one that has people with decolonizing desires to correct the deficit. They're not influenced by the heartbeat of Africa, so they're only positioned geographically in Africa. Since they're not African universities. So many other universities abroad, you go to the UK, Oxford University might produce knowledge for the world, but it is a British university, right? And so is Harvard, a USA university. So what makes the University of Cape Town or Stellenbosch University or whatever an African university?
That's true, Prof. That's a fundamental question. So thanks a lot both to you, Prof. and Grange and Prof. Msila and Prof. Mpine Makoe. who opened the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this discussion. As we know, we're all in the sector. The debate continues. The presentations will be shared. The debate continues. But what, in wrapping up, what I've picked up from the discussion and what the two presenters have done is to alert us to the fact that community engagement or community development by a university is not only the function of a donation to whatever social causes that is there, but is the utilization of the main function of the university for addressing the challenges that are prevalent in a society. Of course, scholarship for its sake is essential. We need free intellectuals, not intellectuals that are pressed on doing things that are having societal impact. But scholarship, it can be that we have universities that can analyze the biggest particles in the galaxy and the smallest particles in the galaxy, but are unable to resolve or make a contribution on social problems that are visible through the eyes, not seen through a telescope. So the debate has enlightened us to such that the university is a microcosm of society,